Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Centre, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Legal Immigration Reform, Challenges and Promising Paths Forward. To introduce myself, my name is Jack Malday. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at BPC. I work on immigration and workforce policy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with BPC, BPC is a mission-focused organization working with both Democrats and Republicans to craft durable, bipartisan solutions to the nation's challenges. During today's panel discussion, you're going to hear about some key challenges facing the legal immigration system, one of which is very large visa backlogs that are creating extraordinary waits for workers and families, often lasting decades. These backlogs have significant economic and social costs. So to kick off the discussion, I'm going to share some preliminary results from some research that BPC has been conducting into the economic impact of clearing current green card backlogs. If we could have the slides up, please. So we have green card backlogs for two key reasons. Firstly, the demand for green cards is exceeding the supply because we have statutory green card limits. This is what we call in our analysis the cap-based backlog. So for example, when it comes to employment-based green cards, there's an annual limit of 140,000. For family-based green cards, there's an annual limit of 226,000. And within both of these totals, there are further limits. So there's a per-country limit of 7% of these totals. And both employment-based green cards and family-based green cards have further categorization, and those categories have their own limits. Now, what these limits mean is that the queue is just growing and growing, and there's no actual limit to the size the queue can be. Now, the second reason we have backlogs is because of processing, visa processing. There's a lack of resources required to process all the pending cases, and this has been exacerbated by COVID, when there had to be a halting of visa processing. Now, the distinction between the cap-based backlog and the processing-based backlog is an important one, because different policies would be required to deal with each backlog type. So to deal with the cap-based backlogs, we might look at reforming the caps themselves, raising them, eliminating them, whereas to deal with the processing-based backlogs, we would have to look at increasing the amount of resources that goes towards visa processing. And it's worth noting that to deal with the cap-based backlog, you would also have to have this resource. So in our economic analysis, we're looking at adults specifically because adults participate in the labor force. And what our estimation has found is that the size of the employment-based adult backlog and the family-based adult backlog are both very significant. So the employment-based green card adult backlog, we estimate to be roughly 1.3 million, whereas for family-based, we estimate this to be even larger at 3.4 million. Now, within each backlog, there are people who are currently inside the United States, but also people who are outside the United States. So people in the country, when they receive their green card, they adjust from temporary to permanent status. Whereas those outside the country, when they receive their green card, that allows them to enter the country as new entrants. So what you see in these pie charts is that, let's take the employment-based adult backlog, for example. The vast majority of that backlog are adjustments of status. So the vast majority are people currently inside the country. When it comes to the family-based adult backlog, there's much more of an even split between people in the country and outside. And actually, a thin majority are people outside the country who would then become new entrants. That's important for our economic analysis because we have to treat these two groups differently. So there are two key economic benefits of clearing the backlogs. As I mentioned, this would facilitate immigration into the United States. And what immigration really does is it bolsters our labor force. And that's super important at the moment because of all the labor shortages we're seeing. Immigrants also bring skills and knowledge to the country that can complement those of the native-born workers. And so immigration can have productivity benefits as well. When it comes to adjustments of status, these also have economic benefits. When you're on a temporary visa, there are certain restrictions to the jobs you can take. But when you get your green card and you adjust to permanent status, these restrictions largely fall away. So people, when they adjust to permanent status, they can access a wider range of jobs that are more suited for them, and they can be more productive. So I don't want to go into too much detail about methodology, but when we're actually estimating the impacts, we again draw this distinction between immigration and adjustments of status. So to estimate the economic impact of immigration, we're looking at very well-respected economic studies that estimate the impact of immigration on GDP and productivity. To estimate the economic benefit of adjustments of status, we're looking at studies that estimate the wage impacts of these adjustments. So when people adjust to permanent status, there is research that shows they tend to get higher wages. And the reason we're interested in wages is because a boost in wages should, according to economic theory, reflect a boost in productivity. So now the moment you've all been waiting for are preliminary results. So the numbers you see in the table are GDP gains over 10 years from clearing the backlogs. And what you can notice is that the benefits are really significant for both the employment-based and family-based backlogs. At the lower end, we're still looking at over $100 billion worth of GDP gains. Now, the family-based backlog does have larger benefits of clearing. This is primarily driven by the larger size of those backlogs. And it's worth noting that further research could more accurately estimate the benefits of clearing the employment-based backlog, because employment-based green cards tend to go to people of higher than average skill levels, and they would likely have greater productivity impacts. Now, a really important thing to note is that our analysis considers clearing current backlogs, not future backlogs. Policy changes, such as adjusting green card limits, would have impacts not only on current backlogs, but also future backlogs. So those policies would have even greater economic benefits than what you see on the slide. So I want to finish by saying, please look out for our upcoming report, which we plan to publish in early fall. That will go into more detail about the methodology. It will also include some further analysis, for example, estimating the geographic distribution of these economic benefits, estimating the net fiscal impacts, so the impact on the federal and state budget, and it will also include some policy recommendations that follow from the analysis. I want to finish by saying, please do get in touch if you have any questions or comments at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. So that's enough from me. I would like to invite our panelists and our moderator, Andrew Craigbaum from Bloomberg Law, to the stage. Feel free to come up. And I just want to say to those online, feel free to pop questions into the chat whilst the panel discussion is going on, and Andrew may ask a few to the panel. Towards the end of the event, there will be an opportunity for people in the room to ask questions using a mic. So, Andrew, over to you.
All right, thanks a lot. I've been looking forward to this discussion because, well, immigration gets a lot of headlines, a lot of attention from lawmakers. There's, I think, remarkably little attention given to the challenges in our legal immigration system. And as you'll hear from our panelists, there's a lot of challenges on that front. That's not too surprising when you consider that the last comprehensive immigration reform was in 1990. That was about 6 months, just to give some perspective, before Michael Jordan won his first NBA title, and a year before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the first text message exchange. Now, as you've heard from Jack, we're losing out on significant economic growth in the U.S. as a result of immigration restrictions that have been in place for decades. And our panelists will fill you in on how the immigration barriers are keeping out skilled workers, in industries with dire need for foreign talent, preventing family reunification, and even forcing many young people who grew up in the U.S. to leave the country. But there are some reasons for optimism that we'll dig into as well. So I'm going to have some questions to prompt discussion, and we'll be taking some questions from the audience online and in person later on as well. But introduce our panel. We've got joining us to my left, David Beer, the Associate Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute, and previously Senior Policy Advisor at the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration. We've got Martin Kim, Director of Immigration Advocacy at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where he focuses on a more fair family-based immigration system in particular. Martin was previously Deputy Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs at the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And we've got Deep Patel, who's a pharmacist and founder of Improve the Dream, which is a grassroots organization advocating for immigrants known as documented dreamers who grew up in the U.S., but now face the prospect of aging out of the legal immigration system. And then finally, John Basilisi, Vice President of Immigration Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. John was previously an advisor in Marco Rubio's office, where he was a lead advisor during the Gang of Eight discussions on immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform back in 2013. So David, I'd like to start with you. There's a common refrain you hear from opponents of immigration relief that folks should just get in line, come the right way, etc. You had a provocatively titled report earlier this summer called "Why Legal Immigration is Nearly Impossible." So can you unpack why that is? What does the system look like for someone who's trying to come to the U.S. legally or even stay here after attending college or grad school?
Right, so there's effectively just four options for people who are right now abroad. They're trying to come to the United States. The refugee program, got 100 million people displaced worldwide. The United States last year took 25,000 refugees. Even if we triple that, I mean, it's basically like winning the lottery. Then we actually have the diversity visa lottery, which is 20 million applicants, 55,000 selected. Again, your odds are really low, and they've been declining over time as the number of applicants has increased. And then you have the family-sponsored system, and that's only for close relatives of legal permanent residents and U.S. citizens. And there, we talked about the backlogs. I mean, the backlogs are just so incredible now that the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, if you petition for your brother, you're from Mexico, you're entitled under our laws to petition for them to receive permanent residence. They just put that in a file. They don't open it. They don't look at it. It's just a number in a spreadsheet somewhere, because they know that backlog is so long that brother of yours will never be able to immigrate legally through the system that Congress created. And then, of course, the last one is employer-sponsored immigration. And we heard about the backlogs again. Half the applicants are from India. The backlog for India is so long that a new applicant is likely to die before they get a green card through that system. Again, we talked about the country caps. That's part of our system, where we decide each country only gets a certain amount, and they're 50% of the applicants, but they only get 7% of the green cards, unless some would otherwise go unused. So it's a very restrictive system, and the idea that you can just get in line isn't true. You need the sponsorship, you need the selection by the government, and so the vast majority of these people who are trying to come have no legal path or opportunity to do so and become permanent residents.
John, on that employer-sponsored visa front, there were 780,000 registrations earlier this year, more than 780,000 for the H-1B visa lottery for specialty occupation workers, jobs, talking about jobs mostly in tech, engineering, et cetera. There's just 85,000 of those slots available a year. So that mismatch, what does that say about the challenges that industries in the U.S. are facing to bring in workers they need?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me here today to participate on this panel. In terms of the impact that this has on companies, it really is, it's like a raffle. What can we do to get as many tickets into the barrel when they spin it and they start picking people out of this? And the complete lack of certainty that a company has when it comes to being able to plan, not just this year's projects, but if you're planning on, maybe you're a semiconductor company that wants to build a new fab someplace in the United States. These are decisions that take years to make. And for them, they need to know that if I need the engineers here to design the factory, build the equipment, operate the equipment, if they can't get them, it's really tough to justify, all right, we need to build this here, or we need to expand to this size. And, you know, the H-1B is just one aspect of this. There are an alphabet soup of non-immigrant visa categories that companies use. The O's, L's, P's. There's also not just H-1Bs, but you think of H-2As for ag and H-2Bs for seasonal non-agricultural work. All of it is, we talked about, Jack, not just the CAP-based backlogs, but the processing backlogs. When one program has an issue, it's not as if these government agencies operate with unlimited resources. Once you start seeing a spike for something else, it tends to impact everybody else that's trying to get another visa into the system. And, you know, David called it restrictive. And the funny thing is it wasn't restrictive by design. It's restrictive because it's been neglected for 3 decades. If you had a system that actually responded to market signals, maybe you wouldn't have problems that are as big as they are today. But depending upon what section of the INA you're looking at, it was either designed in 1965, 1986, or 1990. No matter how you look at it, some of these sections are about as old as I am. Some of them are older than I am. It's ridiculous that Congress hasn't done anything to update these problems or address these problems. But we are where we are.
Yeah. Deep, you got a pretty unique perspective on the lack of action by Congress for decades. So can you explain, like, these numerical caps, how are they contributing to these age-out issues for children of Indian immigrants in particular?
So one of the issues that I think most Americans probably would have no idea exists is the fact that it's possible for an immigrant child to be brought to the United States legally, be raised and educated here, but still not have a clear way to stay or a path to citizenship. Most people would be surprised by that. And unfortunately, that is the way our current system is. And as David and John mentioned, the reason this happens is because we have these insanely long backlogs, which result in families moving here with their children, raising those families, and then their government still has not approved the green card applications that may have been filed decades ago. And the current wait times for those are really long. And another reason this happens is also some other visas which allow immigrants to come here to start small businesses, which don't actually have pathways to citizenship. So in both of these scenarios, there's young people who have always been here on a visa status that are growing up here as Americans. And unfortunately, when they turn 21, they're kicked out of either their parents' green card application, and then they have to find their own way to stay. And eventually, when their luck runs out, they have to either leave the country or just fight the system as if they were coming to the country for the very first time. So all of their time spent growing up in the country would be rendered useless. And our current system, which hasn't been updated in 30, 40, 50 years, is worsening this effect because every year there's over 10,000 new individuals in this situation that are aging out. And unless the caps are updated or there's policies put in place that would ensure that these individuals being raised and educated here are allowed to stay, it's going to keep getting worse. The backlogs are going to keep getting worse. And I think this is the biggest brain drain for our country. And thankfully, Congress is starting to kind of recognize that. And one of the legislations introduced to address this, the America's Children Act, has received tremendous bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate.
Great. Martin, the vast majority of immigrants who get green cards do so through the family-based system, but right now it's more than 3.5 million folks waiting outside the country to come to the U.S. Can you explain how there's varying caps, right, depending on their country of birth, their relationship to the sponsor of the visa? How does that affect all the wait times that folks are facing?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And as some of my other panelists have pointed out, this is an outdated system, right? So in 1990, you have certain levels of family immigration, employment-based immigration that are set. And the way the system works now in terms of the family-based visas in particular is there are certain categories of relatives that are uncapped, that are not subject to any sort of cap. So they're called immediate relatives of US citizens, which includes minor unmarried children, parents of US citizens, spouses of US citizens. There's also exemption for children born to LPRs when they're briefly abroad. But for the other types of family members who can be sponsored, and that's a limited pool already, there are caps, right? And so some of the worst backlogs happen when there's a lot of demand, as people have already noted, and there simply are not enough visas. So some categories include, for example, married adult children of US citizens, siblings of US citizens. Those are categories of relatives who can be sponsored, who have a right to come to the US, and currently are facing 10, 20-year backlogs for some countries.
What kind of impact does that have on folks here now?
Yeah, so when we work, so as you introduced me, I'm with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We serve a very immigrant-heavy population. 2/3 of Asian Americans are immigrants, and the majority, like other immigrants, have come through on the family-based system. And we can talk, obviously, about the human impacts of being separated from your child or your parent for decades. But there's also an economic impact, right, that folks have already talked about. One of the things I like to say is sometimes people forget that family members who are sponsored to come to the US come here and they also work, right? It's not just employment-based immigrants who work in the US. And they work, oftentimes they work as caretakers for their family members, right? They serve as economic, social, emotional support for their family members in the US. And so the fact that some people have been waiting 10, 20 years to be reunited with their family members has really negatively affected the economy, these families, and the US as a whole.
Could I just add on? One interesting thing about these different categories is if you look at it, the wait time, if you're an unmarried child of a US citizen who's an adult, your wait time will increase by about double if you get married, because you jump from one category to the next. So there's this huge marriage penalty built into this categorization system that we've created. And if we talked about unmarried minor child, so that's someone under the age of 21. Let's say you want to get married. You get married, all of a sudden now you're in a capped category for the first time, and you have to wait 20 years before you get to immigrate. So you go from 0 waiting due to the cap to just an incredible wait. So there's a weird interplay between marriage and how long you have to wait under this system. The other interesting thing about the unmarried minor children, parents, these exempt categories, they don't get to bring their dependents. So if I sponsor my parent to come, and they've remarried, that their spouse has no right to come under our current system. So there's these bizarre interactions between these different categorizations that result in family separation and really a lot of problems, penalties for marriage and so forth.
David, when you look at this system that's like has all these Byzantine rules and caps in place, hasn't been updated for decades. So it allows other countries to come in, offer new pathways to permanent residency, citizenship that are just a lot easier to navigate. Canada, most recently, they just launched this program like explicitly targeting H-1B visa holders, offered 10,000 slots with a pathway to permanent residency. Apparently, they were all claimed within 48 hours this week. So, what does that show or illustrate about the challenges these folks are facing? These are the folks who actually like won the H-1B lottery, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is even more detrimental. So 10,000 might not seem that big, but that's out of 85,000 slots. So we're losing even more than just the people who would have won the lottery if we had more slots available to them. And yeah, there's great hardships. You're talking about the aging out of their children. If their children have no path to permanent status in the United States, that's a big motivating factor. If you have no ability to move up in your career because you're stuck in a job where your employer has sponsored you and you have to stay in that job in order to qualify for the green card that they sponsored you under, that's a big disincentive. So Canada's offer is very attractive to people who are stuck in these situations. And this is part of a much broader situation. In the 1990s, the United States accounted for a majority of the increase in the immigrant population worldwide. A majority of immigrants were moving to the United States. That's incredible. Today, it's less than 10% are moving to the United States. So it is a big deal, a massive shift in population away from the United States to other countries, and we're losing out as a result.
And if I may add to all this, what really scares me and a lot of the member companies that the U.S. Chamber represents is that this is a proof of concept. That another country can literally come in here and say, hey, we're going to poach your workers. And thus far, we're not really doing much to stop it. And as someone who's from upstate New York, I have more than a few Canadian friends. I don't want to be mean to our neighbors to the north. But if anybody here remembers the show Saved by the Bell, we're AC Slater and they're Screech. Screech doesn't steal Slater's lunch. But that's what's happening here. And we can't let this go unanswered. Like, something has to happen. And I want to give credit where credit's due. Senators Durbin and Rounds introduced a new bill yesterday to try to keep STEM talent in the country. What worries me is that is this just another exercise of putting a bill out there, or are we actually going to get this thing done? Because to me, I'm certainly hoping that this is a shot across every member of Congress's bow, knowing that this is not going to stop if this happens and it goes unanswered.
So, John, maybe you can explain what that bill would do, but we're not just having like Canada and other countries compete for immigrants who are here. We're actually having U.S. companies like park talent in offices across the border because they can't keep them here, right?
There's quite a few companies that have done this, just knowing the problems that they have getting talent here. You see a lot of, in the Seattle, Pacific Northwest, you see offices being expanded in Vancouver. If companies have operations in Detroit, you see them across the river in Windsor. This is an issue that, and it's not just to our friends to the north, it's also, you see people moving operations to Mexico as well. It's a problem because of the lack of certainty that companies have that they will be able to get the talent they need to build the products or services that their company provides to their clients. And to your question about what does the Keep STEM Talent Act do, it provides an awful lot more certainty to companies that are looking to keep their STEM talent in the United States. It allows them to come into the U.S. or qualify for visas that It would no longer be subject to the direct numerical limitations, which is huge. It basically puts you in that section of the INA that says, all right, these people will not count towards the cap. And it's for individuals who have a master's degree or higher in a STEM field. And those are the types of policies we should be pursuing in order to make sure that that type of talent doesn't leave, because it's tough to find.
The U.S. is still identified in like most surveys I've seen as the preferred destination by far for immigrants, especially folks coming working in industries like tech. Could that start to change? Are you seeing that change at all for folks, especially for like really backlogged countries like India, where they're looking at these issues like age-out issues and saying, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want my kids to have to deal with that.
This could start to change if age out amongst us other issues aren't fixed in the near future. There have been surveys in the past where those in the families in the backlog have stated the number one issue they're looking to abandon their petition and go back to their home country is because of their children aging out. There have been physicians in rural areas of the country that have actually went back to India because their children were aging out. There's another story of a small business owner from Florida whose daughter aged out, and she's actually a nursing graduate in the midst of the pandemic, and she was forced to self-deport after having grown up in the country. It makes no sense, but she had to self-deport back to Europe, and her family closed down their business and went back to Europe as well. So it just shows that the impact of this is not just amongst our families and on a local level. It makes an economic impact in the community, in the state, and nationally. But if those policies aren't changed, this will keep getting worse, and more people will start abandoning their petitions, and other countries, will poach the talent of America.
Yeah, Martin, part of the barrier for new immigrants is the cost of applying for a visa, right? And U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services earlier this year, they put out a proposal that would hike fees across the board. Employers would take the biggest hit, but can you talk about how fee increases make it harder for folks to bring their relatives to the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've worked on as an organization quite a bit, making the immigration system more affordable, both in terms of for folks outside the U.S. looking to come to the country, as well as for those looking to naturalize, because we know naturalization comes with a lot of benefits, not just for individuals, not just for their families, but also for the economy and for the country as a whole. When it comes to those fee increases, we were pleased to see, I mean, as you may know, in the previous administration, there was another attempt to raise fees, and it looked very different from this most recent fee proposal. We are still concerned that it will make immigrating less attractive. It will make it harder for folks to immigrate, and also, for many of the applications involved, fee waivers are not available, right, for low-income individuals. So in essence, the higher the fees get, the more likely we are to discourage people who might come here and make a life for themselves, right, but who are discouraged by the necessary fees, right? I was actually just talking on my way over here from the airport with someone who is engaged, wants to get married, and was like telling me about the fees involved, right? This is someone who's a U.S. citizen already, right? Who wants to bring their fiance over. And someone who, is making a living, not someone who's depending on state resources, for example.
All right. And John, this new fee structure that's put out by USCIS, it's also kind of putting employers on the hook for paying for asylum costs.
A whole slew of things. And I will be brief and say that the anger that I heard from our members was just palpable on every call that I had once that proposal came out. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I do believe USCIS is rethinking its approach. It'll be very interesting to see what the final rule looks like, because it would be just another, notch on the side of saying, oh, well, this is another disincentive to trying to bring talent to the U.S.
And to just add on to that, actually, one of the problems, of course, is that USCIS is primarily a fee-funded agency, right? So oftentimes that is their rationale for raising fees. They're like, we need to meet costs. There's an influx of applications, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we have raised, as advocates is the possibility, perhaps, of allocating additional funding to USCIS, and that has happened before, including, I believe, on the employment-based side for processing, and that's had fairly positive results. So that's something I think is worth looking at, and I know that it's something we've raised with USCIS before as well.
Sure. David, so even though there's been we've seen inaction from Congress, but there's been a lot happening still in the illegal immigration system. The Biden administration, CBS News reported this week, they brought in more than 500,000 new immigrants the past 2 years through parole authority, which allows the government to admit people without visas and then seek some kind of longer-term status. And meanwhile, we're seeing new arrivals at the Mexican border decline. So, do you see a link there, and what kind of model does the parole authority offer for further expansions to the legal system?
Well, I think what they've done is, take a really terrible situation, which is all these people showing up at the border, total chaos, and replace it with a Band-Aid, which is temporary authorization to travel to the United States if you have a sponsor in the country legally who can financially support you if need be. And so that's a much better situation than having people just show up randomly at the border and cross the border illegally. So the programs have been effective, and I think they are pioneering a model for how we can look at immigration reform, certainly in response to these immigration crises going forward. Unfortunately, they don't have the authority to create permanent status for these people. They would have to apply for asylum, and that is an extremely narrow pathway. You have to have a very high standard for demonstrating that you face persecution based on a protected grounds. So many of these people, parole status is all they're going to get. And it's 2 years. This administration, they'll probably renew them for another 2 years, but any other administration, all bets are off. And it's a big deal because, like you said, 500,000, that's 500,000 people who Americans want to sponsor to come here. That's incredible in and of itself. The other thing is that's 500,000 people who aren't showing up at the border to seek asylum or to cross illegally. So there are important benefits to it, but I do think that we need to focus on it as a model for how to actually reform the permanent system through Congress, because this is not the answer. You can't just have only this pathway be available.
Gotcha. Deep, you mentioned the America's Children Act earlier, but just to keep the focus on the executive branch for a minute, I know Improve the Dream I hope that the DACA rule released last year would include documented dreamers brought here through the legal system. That didn't end up happening. But what options do you see available to the administration to provide some relief to young people at risk of aging out?
Yeah, so unfortunately, one of the big policies administratively that Improved the Dream was advocating for was, to include children of visa holders as a part of the DACA protections, but that was not able to go through. However, there are certain other administrative actions that they can take. One of which is something that the Supreme Court about a decade ago already said they have the authority to do, which is to allow children who age out to retain their priority dates. That's something the administration could have the Justice Department go ahead and change the internal policy on, which would allow individuals who grew up here and had a active green card petition but aged out when they turned 21, they would be able to retain their previous priority date once they, if their parents were to sponsor them after they receive a green card under the family-based petition. So if it's like a F2B or another petition. So that's one of those ways. There are also other methods the administration could use, including parole. For those who did have to self-deport, they could be brought back under the parole, a similar parole program. And then the administration also has authority to allow individuals who are in aging out circumstances to qualify for a compelling circumstance EADs, which would also allow them protection, extension of status, and work authorization. And this can be done by defining aging out as a compelling circumstance, which they already have authority to do, and they have they actually have a regulation in the works of doing something similar. So the hope would be that the administration uses as much of their authority as they can to make that regulation as broad as possible to provide the best protection.
John, the Biden administration this year, they maxed out the number of temporary work visas available for seasonal jobs like hospitality, landscaping. That was a big ask from the business community. So we're talking about double the number of visas available under the statutory cap set by Congress. Now there's some businesses calling for state-sponsored visas, a state-sponsored visa program to fill other job openings. I know the chamber wants to see a returning worker exemption passed. Can you talk about what tools may be available to the administration that haven't been used, and what you're hoping to see on that front?
Well,
Congress.
On the issue of H-2B visas, these are for individuals who are going to be working in seasonal, non-agricultural jobs. So that's landscaping, hospitality, forestry, just a little bit of construction work, and many others. If you looked at the data from the second quarter this year for DOL, you add 66 to the 64,714, roughly 130 and change. The amount of workers that were sought just in the first half of the year was 150,000. So even for the first half of the year, we're very grateful for the relief that's being provided. It's still not enough, given the economic situation we find ourselves in. And to me, like the returning worker exemption that is currently in the House DHS appropriations bill really supported the efforts by many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to get that included. That's going to help. I think what would really be optimal, not just for H-2B, but for many other capped temporary visa programs, we really need to look at revisiting these quotas. The 66,000 was designed in 1990. You look at the H-1B quota, this is something that the last update, I want to say, was the mid-2000s, which got us the 20,000 U.S. master's degree exemption. So from 65 to 85,000. These caps are nowhere near what's needed. They're completely divorced from economic reality. And until we get serious, not just about those caps, but also the ones on employment-based immigrant visas, because if you look at some of the problems that we have, particularly with high-skilled immigrants, the level of desire to get those temporary visas, it's because there's no permanent categories that they can take advantage of. Like, if you are not just the company that is seeking to hire the individual, but the person that wants to work here in the U.S., you look at this and say, like, my chances are not so good. And until we have systems that, in my view, in a perfect world, or in a more perfect world we find ourselves in today, you would have quotas that would adjust upwards when unemployment's really low, and they would adjust downward when unemployment rises. this is just something that's common sense. It's something that I know many members of Congress have looked at in terms of proposing. You brought the state-based visa ideas. I think it's a great idea. It's been kicking around for decades now. To me, to make that type of concept come to life, you would need to have Congress relinquish some of its authority over immigration to the states. I just don't see that happening. It's not saying it's not possible. I just don't see that happening. But in this town, where there's a will, is a way. So if that's an idea that catches fire, it's going to help our members. We've supported in the past. We'd support it again.
If I could just add on the point about adjustments, if you look at the backlogs for employment-based and family-based, if the number of employment-based green cards had increased in parallel with the increase in GDP, we'd have twice as many green cards today as we had in 1990. And that would completely resolve the issue. We wouldn't have this huge backlog because it really took keeping it at that flat level all these decades to produce this huge catastrophic situation we're dealing with now. And on the family-based side, if in 1990, when they set the family-based cap, the family-based cap was basically equal to the uncapped categories that we're talking about: spouses, parents, minor children of U.S. citizens, basically equal. Then over the next few decades, of course, the country grew in size, there were more immigrants. The uncapped categories is now twice the size of the cap categories. So if they had just kept them linked, we're not going to get rid of the cap, but we just kept them linked, we would not have had this huge explosion in the family-based backlog. So building in mechanisms to make sure that the system does not become outdated immediately after it's passed is critical for immigration reform going forward.
Martin, your organization's backed legislation called the Reuniting Families Act. And one thing that would do is recapture unused green cards from past years. Can you talk about what it would do on that front, what effect that would have, as well as reducing backlogs in the future?
Sure. I mean, actually, it's funny that you should mention the recapture provisions. I mean, we've been pushing recapture as like a first step in like appropriations packages and other efforts, because really we're talking about a few 100,000 wasted visas, which is still egregious when you think of the almost 4 million person backlog. But the Reuniting Families Act, which is sponsored by Rep. Meng and will be, or not Rep. Meng, sorry, Rep. Chu, and will be reintroduced in the next couple of weeks, is really aimed at improving the family-based system in a variety of ways, really raising the visa caps, raising the per-country quotas, and addressing a lot of the issues that we've talked about in terms of, we only really touched on this briefly, but the family-based system, for example, treats immediate relatives of U.S. citizens, so again, minor unmarried children, spouses, differently from unmarried children and spouses of green card holders. And so the Reuniting Families Act would uncap that category of visas. It would also stop the practice of counting derivative visa applicants against the caps. So there's a lot in there, too much to cover in the time we have left. But our hope with that, we understand this is really a marker bill. We don't expect that necessarily to move in this Congress. But we have seen actually, and we were very happy to see, that some bipartisan efforts, including the Dignity Act, did take some of the ideas from the Reuniting Families Act and include it in bipartisan legislation, which I think shows that there is a growing bipartisan awareness of the problems on the family-based side as well as on the employment-based side.
Great. So we've got a few minutes left for questions from our audience. I think we've got one here.
I'm Richard Coleman. I retired 10 years ago from Customs and Border Protection, answering congressional inquiries and trying to, the politics of immigration. But our history has always been, if we can use you to build a railroad, we'll let you in. Otherwise, no Irish need apply, Chinese Exclusion Act. That's in our culture. We have this strong anti-immigrant sentiment that politicians have mined beautifully. So I don't think I'm wondering, no matter how rational, how many business people stand up and say, yeah, we want more immigrants, you're going to get politicians to give up what's been a winning game for them. If you talk about letting Texas have more authority over the cruelty that they've been showing to immigrants, more authority for the state of Texas with immigration, that would be hell on wheels.
David, you want to start?
Look, I think most Americans' biggest concern on immigration is the chaos at the border. They don't like to see the illegality. They don't like to see, big encampments of refugees at the border. They don't like those chaotic elements. And I think having a legal immigration system that allows people to enter legally and in an orderly way removes a lot of their concerns about immigration. Also, having a legal, orderly pathway resolves other concerns too, like they'll line up housing before they show up. That, if you show up at the border and you don't know whether you're going to get in, you can't do that. So a lot of the things that people are most concerned about when it comes to immigration could be resolved through legal immigration reform. I do agree it is a kind of a catch-22. You got to have the reform to make people realize that it works. Unfortunately, I guess the administration has taken the first step and show proof of concept. Hey, look, we can reduce the number of illegal crossings by a lot by just having a legal pathway for people.
I mean, one thing I'll note too is that I hear you on the history, right? Like from my perspective at an Asian American org, we often talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? The explicit targeting of specific populations. But it's also worth noting there is kind of push and pull. And one of the ways I think it's useful to think about this issue is if you look at the last administration and some of the backlash against the harshest policies implemented by that administration, like separation of families and children, right? You see, I think, a general, there's at least some consensus, right, about America as a country of immigrants, American values when it comes to the treatment of immigrants. And yes, there are anti-immigrant voices, but I think there's still room to push some of these policies. And we've seen a lot of bipartisan efforts to do so.
I think when Americans understand how our immigration system really functions right now, the bipartisan support does come. There's several bills in Congress right now where if they were brought to the floor, they would pass quite easily. And I think we need an effort, a bipartisan effort, if they were brought to the floor. So
why are they not brought to the floor? So winning chaos at the border is a political winner. Who's going to give it up?
I think there needs to be a strong bipartisan push to, and I think that's what we need to work on over the next year. But there needs to be a push to do that. I agree.
One other point that I'd add to my fellow panelists is when we're talking about the state-based visa idea that gives states more authority, the more authority is to let more people in, not more authority to create their own new border security policies. That's what those state-based ideas do. At least the bills that I know, the ones that I worked on, I wasn't here in DC when Sam Brownback first started this, but when Ron Johnson proposed this 6 years ago now, this was something, his goal was to let more people in because the economy was heating up. As you can imagine, in Wisconsin, the Dells during the summertime, it's tough. Dairies are always struggling to find people. It's not a silly idea to give a state that says, hey, I want more people to come in here. All right, if your state businesses need them, great. We'll find a way to get them in here. That's what that proposal would do. In terms of the political calculations that get made, it's one thing for the chaos of the border being a political winner for a lot of folks when unemployment's 10% or 8%. We're now hovering around 3.5%. And every congressional office that I talk to tell me to a T, we are hearing more and more from not just businesses, but our boss is hearing from his neighbor. like when you start to hear this more and more, the worm may be turning. Anybody here on this panel that knows me knows I am usually very pessimistic. But when you start to hear these things, maybe things are about to change.
Other questions from the audience? One right here.
Hi. I work with an immigration advocacy group in Florida, and part of that is we have some sponsored families that are on humanitarian parole. So we've been able to see how beneficial that has been, not only just for their incorporation into the community, for the whole family, but also into the workforce. When we talk about, reforming immigration at a congressional level, do you think there could be something like a humanitarian parole that does have a pathway to citizenship? Could that be a viable option for trying to push forward? Do you ever see that as being something that could happen realistically?
Yeah, I actually do. Obviously, there's the precedent of the Cuban Adjustment Act. We've let over, whatever it is, 1.5 million Cubans adjust through that process after they were paroled into the United States. We already have effectively a category that deducts the number of long-term parolees from the family-based cap. So Congress is already thinking about this issue in 1996. I think that we can expand on that and say, look, we need to have an actual pathway for people that we're letting into the country legally. They came in the right way. They should have a path to be able to become permanent residents in this country. And that's going to be a strong argument, especially for many of the populations that were brought in, Ukrainians and Afghans, but also the Haitians and Nicaraguans and Venezuelans who have no path. They don't have the Cuban Adjustment Act, but it's certainly something that as time goes on, the population grows, the pressure to do something is going to build.
So on that note, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us. I think that's all we've got time for. And BPC's Teresa Cardinal-Brown is going to close us out.
Hi there. Yes, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Andrew, for moderating. I'm Teresa Cardinal-Brown. I'm the Senior Advisor for Immigration and Border Policy here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you all who joined us in person. Thank you to those of you who joined us online. We look forward to doing more of this work. You can find reports that we have done on options for the legal immigration system, the economic case for immigration, border issues. All of that is available on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. We also do a podcast called This Week in Immigration, which is available on all your major podcast platforms, except Stitcher, which is going away. And we cover the latest and greatest in immigration policy, news, great guest stars. This last week, we had Julie Stuft, who's the head of the Visa Office at State Department, to talk about State Department backlogs. We've had members of Congress on. We talk about the latest news. We've had reporters and others. So if you have a chance, look up This Week in Immigration. But thank you very much for coming. We look forward to seeing you at another event soon.